"Hey, what's your rank, son?" The question landed in the corridor of Marine Corps Base Quantico, with the particular snap of a man who uses questions the way some men use doors, to establish who is entering and who is staying out. Captain Derek Lassiter was 29 years old and stood at the entrance to the Officer Leadership Symposium Hall with his cover under his arm and his uniform pressed to the edge of geometry, his eyes moving over the old man with the slow, categorical assessment of someone who has been trained to evaluate and is currently evaluating. The old man was pushing a mop. Roy Callahan was 84 years old. He wore a faded gray uniform shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, dark work trousers with a crease that had long since made its peace with the demands of honest labor, and a pair of rubber-soled shoes that did not announce themselves. His hands on the mop handle were large and brown and quiet, the knuckles swollen with the specific architecture of 8 decades. The fingers steady in the particular way of hands that have been given many things to hold and have held all of them. He had been working his way down the corridor in the methodical pattern of a man who understands that the floor is the floor and it will be cleaned the way it needs to be cleaned. And he had not looked up when Lassiter spoke. The corridor at Quantico's Leadership Hall smelled of industrial cleaner and old wood, and the institutional gravity of a building that has been making officers since before most people alive today were born. Portrait photographs of generals lined the upper walls, 60 years of faces. The morning light came through high windows in long, flat planes and lay across the corridor floor in a way that made the space feel designed to mean something. Roy Callahan was working in one of those planes of light, the gray shirt, the mop, the slow, patient arc of a man doing his job. He still hadn't looked up. Lassiter's jaw tightened slightly. He had asked a question. He was accustomed to questions being answered. He stepped closer, his posture the easy posture of institutional authority, the posture that comes from being 29 and a captain in the United States Marine Corps at the institution that trains Marine officers, and from having a room full of junior officers 20 feet behind him who were watching, which he was aware of, and which had, in small ways he did not fully examine, shaped the asking of the question. "Son," he said again, louder, "I asked you a question." Roy Callahan looked up. His eyes were gray, the color of gunmetal that has been in service a long time and carries the record of what it has been asked to do in its surface. They settled on Lassiter with the unhurried quality of something that has been settling on things for 8 decades and is no longer in a hurry about it. They absorbed the captain's rank insignia and his pressed uniform and his audience without particular interest in any of it. "I'm retired," Roy said. His voice was low and even, like a creek that has been running in the same channel for so long the channel is its own nature. "I work here now." Lassiter held a beat of silence, then turned back toward the open doorway and the junior officers beyond it, with the slight expansive gesture of a man who has just been given something that will work well for his purposes. "Retired," he said, at a volume that carried. "From what service?" "Marines," Roy said. He turned back to the mop. "Marines." Lassiter turned fully back to the doorway and addressed the gathered lieutenants and second officers with the particular brightness of a man offering his audience an object lesson that has arrived at convenient timing. "That's the thing about the Corps, gentlemen. Some of us retire to the boardroom. Some of us retire to..." Well, he let the corridor fill in the rest. A few of the junior officers produced the response this required. 2 of them did not. One of the ones who didn't was Second Lieutenant Yusuf Adeyemi, 23 years old, 6 months out of the basic school, who had been watching the corridor exchange with an attention that had nothing to do with the humor Lassiter was mining from it. He had been watching the old man's hands. He had been watching the way the old man had looked at Lassiter. Not with anger, not with hurt, with a quality of stillness that Adeyemi had seen once before. and a gunnery sergeant who had 3 combat deployments, and who had the same quality of not needing to defend himself, because he had long since ceased to be the kind of thing that required defense. He had been watching the patch on the old man's shirt pocket, a small thing, dark with wear, that he could not make out from this distance, but that had produced in him the specific unease of a person who suspects they are in the presence of something they do not have the information to evaluate correctly. Lassiter stepped into the corridor and put his hand on the mop handle, not taking it. Not an aggressive move, but the hand of a man making a point through contact. "I'll tell you what," he said, at the volume of a man still speaking to his audience through the old man. "Why don't you come tell these officers what rank you retired at? Good for morale. Good for the institution." He tapped the mop handle twice. The industrial cleaner smell dropped away. The noise was the thing you never forgot. Not the specific sounds. The specific sounds varied, but the register of them. The frequency that combat lives at, which is not the frequency of any other experience, and which the body recognizes before the mind does, the way the body recognizes the smell of its own home in the dark. He was 22 years old. He was lying in a crater on a hillside outside Chosun Reservoir, North Korea, November 1950, with a radio in one hand and the conviction, not hope, not possibility, but the flat operational certainty of a man who has assessed his situation and found it navigable, that the Marines on the reverse slope were going to hold, and that the Chinese forces that had been pressing the line for 11 hours were going to discover this in approximately 20 minutes if someone on his side of the radio got the fire mission coordinates into the correct hands in the next 4 minutes. His name on the radio was Viper 2. The call sign had been assigned by the forward air controller who trained him, a first lieutenant named George Rains, who had the habit of assigning call signs based on what he observed about a man's method in the field. And what he had observed about Roy Callahan was that he was quiet and patient and went in close when necessary and never missed. He had given him Viper 2 in September. In October, George Rains had taken a round outside Wonsan and been evacuated to Japan. Roy Callahan had worked the radio alone since then. The radio was heavy and cold. Korea in November. A cold with no analogy in the continental United States, which had been killing men more efficiently than the enemy for the previous 2 weeks. His left hand was numb below the wrist. He had been numb for 6 hours and had stopped addressing it because addressing it was not going to change it, and the fire mission was what needed addressing. He keyed the radio. He gave the coordinates with the precision of a man who understands that the difference between the right coordinate and the wrong one is the difference between the friendly position and the enemy position, and that difference is never abstract. The voice that came back on the other end of the radio was a major's voice, and it was the voice of a man under the same pressure that Roy was under and who had been under it for longer, and it cracked slightly at the end of 2 of his words, and it said, "Viper 2. Confirm those coordinates." Roy confirmed them. "Viper 2, that fire mission is going to land inside the safe margin for friendly positions." "I know," Roy said. "Run it anyway. The line will hold." There was a pause on the radio that lasted 4 seconds and felt longer, and was the pause of a man deciding whether to trust another man with a decision that would be the last decision if it was wrong. "How do you know the line will hold?" the major said. Roy had been watching the reverse slope for 11 hours. The way the Marines on it moved and absorbed pressure and adjusted and communicated. He had been watching with the quality of attention that is not hope or analysis, but the accumulated result of everything a person has learned, applied to one question. "Because they're Marines," Roy said. "Run the mission." The major ran it. The line held. Afterward, a sergeant came down the reverse slope to the crater and stood over Roy and looked at the radio and at Roy's hand and at the position marks in the frozen dirt, and did not say anything for a long moment. "You called that in from here," the sergeant said. It was not a question. "Yes," the sergeant reached into his jacket and took out a small card, the kind of laminated call sign card that fax carried, worn with handling, the edges soft. On it, in grease pencil, was written Viper 2. The sergeant held it out. "Rains made me promise to find you if anything happened to him," the sergeant said. "He said you'd need to keep the call sign. Said whoever has Viper 2 on their radio keeps the hills quiet." Roy took the card. The sergeant went back up the slope. 3 days later, the sergeant whose name Roy never learned was killed in the final push on the Chosin perimeter. He was 24 years old. Roy Callahan blinked. The corridor light came back. The portraits. The plane of morning sun. Lassiter's hand was on the mop handle. Second Lieutenant Yusuf Adeyemi had made a decision. He had been making it for the last 90 seconds, and it had become final in the moment that Lassiter tapped the mop handle the second time. Because the second tap carried a quality that the first had not, and the quality was the quality of a man who has located an object lesson and is not going to release it. And Adeyemi had looked at the old man's face in the moment of the second tap and had seen nothing change in it. No flinch, no heat, no appeal. Just the gray eyes and the stillness and the patch on the shirt pocket that he still could not read at this distance. He excused himself from the doorway with the plausible reason of needing the head, and he went down the corridor in the other direction. And he found the administrative office at the corridor's end, and inside the administrative office was a staff sergeant named Park, who coordinated visiting personnel and logistical support for the symposium, and who had, in Adeyemi's assessment, the specific quality of someone who would know things. "Staff Sergeant," Adeyemi said, "the janitor in the main corridor. What do you know about him?" Park set down what he was holding with the deliberateness of a man making room to give something his full attention. Park told him in 3 sentences. The third sentence made Adeyemi very still. Then Park added a name and a call sign, and Adeyemi's expression did what expressions do when a person has just understood the size of something. "Is there a colonel in this building right now?" Adeyemi said. "Colonel Merritt is in the East Wing, sir. I need you to call him," Adeyemi said. "Right now. Tell him Roy Callahan is in the main corridor." He paused. "Tell him Viper 2 is in the main corridor." Park reached for the phone without further conversation. The call lasted 30 seconds. On the other end, Colonel Nathan Merritt, commanding officer of Officer Candidate School, 26 years in the Corps. A man who had encountered the name Roy Callahan in the institutional history of this base when he first took command, and had then spent an afternoon in the archives reading things that had reorganized several of his assumptions about what a person could do. Listened to the call sign and was out of his chair before Park finished the sentence. He said 2 words, "I'm coming." Then he said one more, "Who else is in the building?" And when Park told him, he said, "Get General Walsh's aide." General Walsh, Major General, Deputy Commandant for Combat Development, was in a planning session when his aide knocked and opened the door and said something low. The general's face did what Colonel Merritt's face had done. He stood mid-sentence and said, "Excuse me," and by the time he reached the main hallway, he was moving at the pace of a man who has somewhere to be and has known it for a long time. Adeyemi returned to the doorway with the quiet expression of a person carrying knowledge and walked back into his position among the junior officers and waited. In the corridor, Lassiter had reached the phase of his audience performance that required something from its subject. He had returned to the doorway and the junior officers with his material, and now he wanted a response from the old man that would either validate the lesson or provide the kind of dignified refusal that was itself a kind of lesson. He looked back down the corridor. Roy Callahan was mopping. He had not stopped mopping. He had not adjusted his pace or his pattern or any element of what he was doing. He was moving in the methodical arc of a man who has a floor to clean and is cleaning it. And Lassiter's performance existed entirely in the air around him without touching him. Lassiter was formulating a third approach when the footsteps came from the east wing, not the sound of a man walking, but the sound of a man executing a decision with the full weight of his authority behind each stride. Then a second set. Controlled voices adjusting to a change in the pace of the morning. Colonel Nathan Merritt came around the corner of the East Wing corridor. He was 51 years old, solid, moving with the specific velocity of a man who has been handed information that required him to move. Behind him, at the same pace, came Major General Daniel Walsh. They came down the corridor past Lassiter without acknowledgement, not rudely, but with the focused indifference of men whose attention is entirely elsewhere. They passed the open doorway and the assembled junior officers without registering any of it. They walked to Roy Callahan. Lassiter turned. He watched this happen. The assembly of junior officers in the doorway watched this happen with the collective stillness of people in the presence of something that has not yet finished arriving. Roy Callahan looked up from the mop at the colonel and the general, and something passed between the three of them that had no requirement for language. The specific acknowledgement of people who share the knowledge of what the institution was built on. Looking at one of the things it was built on. Major General Daniel Walsh came to attention in front of Roy Callahan. He rendered the sharpest, most breathtakingly precise salute that Derek Lassiter had ever seen in any context. And Lassiter had seen salutes, had practiced salutes, understood the geometry of the gesture with the technical fluency of a Marine officer trained at Quantico. This was not a gesture of geometry. This was a salute that carried in it every year of the general's service, directed at the old man in the gray work shirt with the mop. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3. The corridor went absolutely still. Roy Callahan set the mop against the wall with the deliberateness of a man preparing to give something his full attention. He came to attention. He raised his right hand, large, brown, the knuckles of 8 decades, and returned the salute with a precision that required a moment to take in, because it should not have been possible, and it was. And then he lowered it, and Walsh lowered his. Lassiter's jaw was open. Colonel Merritt stepped forward and addressed the corridor. Not just Lassiter, not just the junior officers, but the space, the portraits on the walls, the morning light. His voice was measured and without performance. "I am going to tell you who this man is," he said, "and I want everyone in this building to hear it." He did not need a document. He had spent an afternoon in the archives, and he had carried what he found there since the day he read it. Roy James Callahan. Gunnery Sergeant, United States Marine Corps, retired, service period, 1948 to 1972, 24 years. He looked at the junior officers in the doorway. He was at Chosin Reservoir in November of 1950. He was a forward air controller's radio operator, working alone after his FAC was evacuated wounded, calling in fire missions from forward positions that placed him inside the safe margin of his own fire support. He paused. He did this for 11 consecutive days, in conditions that killed Marines who were not in his position. He directed fire that is credited in the battalion after action report with preserving the line on 3 separate occasions during the withdrawal from Chosin. The withdrawal that the Commandant's own history describes as the most demanding combat operation in the history of the United States Marine Corps. The corridor was a held breath. His radio call sign was Viper 2. Merritt said it quietly and let it stand. 11 days. Alone, below zero temperatures. Inside his own fire support margin. The after-action report lists Viper 2 by call sign 18 separate times. He looked at Roy. 18 times. The historians who compiled the regimental history spent 2 years trying to find the man behind that call sign. They found him 20 years after the war, working a farm in rural Virginia. And when they asked him why he hadn't come forward, he said, "I wasn't trying to be found." The work was done. No one in the corridor made a sound. Awards, Merritt continued. The Navy Cross, the Purple Heart, awarded twice, the Bronze Star with Combat Valor, the Presidential Unit Citation with the 1st Marine Division. He stopped for a moment. And this building. He looked at the portraits on the walls, 60 years of faces, men and women who had passed through this institution and been hung on its walls. The doctrine for forward air controller radio operations that is taught in this building, the doctrine these officers are here to study, was developed in part from the after-action analysis of Viper 2's operations at Chosin. The methods he used, the decisions he made, the way he called fire. He looked at Lassiter directly, and his voice did not change temperature. The curriculum you are teaching from Captain was built on what this man did on a hillside in Korea 74 years ago, when he was 22 years old. Alone, the silence was complete and absolute, and of a kind that the portraits on the walls seemed to recognize. General Walsh lowered his salute hand, which he had held raised for the duration of Merritt's remarks, and nodded once at Roy Callahan with the expression of a man who has no additional words that are adequate to the situation. The formal counseling of Captain Lassiter concluded over 2 weeks with a written reprimand and a mandatory mentorship assignment paired with a senior officer tasked with addressing what the review board described, with some care, as the gap between institutional authority and institutional knowledge. The review was not punitive in the way that ends careers. Lassiter was talented. The institution knew what it was doing with him. After the corridor had cleared and the general and the colonel had done what the situation required of them and moved to other matters, Roy Callahan picked up the mop. Lassiter came down the corridor. He walked to Roy and stopped and stood for a moment, with the specific difficulty of a person approaching a thing without their armor. Roy looked at him. The gray eyes, the stillness, the depth that had been there before the morning and would be there after it. "I owe you an apology," Lassiter said. "The way I treated you in front of those officers, I was performing. I made you an object lesson in something I didn't understand. That was wrong." Roy looked at him for a moment. Then he placed his hand on Lassiter's shoulder, the same shoulder that had been squared toward him with such institutional confidence an hour before, and held it there, and Lassiter looked at the hand and looked up. "The rank isn't the thing," Roy said. His voice was what it had always been, the low creak, the settled register. "The rank is what lets you do the thing. The thing is what matters." He removed his hand. "In 30 years, the officers in that room are not going to remember your rank. They're going to remember whether you made them better or you made them perform." He glanced at the portraits on the wall, 60 years of faces. Every one of those men and women figured that out eventually. The question is when. He turned back to the mop. It was a Sunday morning 8 weeks later, at a diner in Stafford, Virginia. The kind of place with leather-backed stools and the smell of coffee and the comfortable noise of a Sunday that has decided not to be in a hurry about anything. Lassiter was in a booth near the window in civilian clothes, with the quietness of a man who has spent 2 months understanding the difference between a lesson received and a lesson learned. He saw the gray shirt through the window before the door opened. He was outside before the coffee cooled. "Mr. Callahan." Roy Callahan stopped on the diner step and looked at him with the gunmetal eyes and the stillness that had nothing to prove. Lassiter stood in front of the man without rank and without audience. "I wanted to apologize properly," he said. "Not the way I did it in the corridor. That was still partly for the room. This is just for you." He looked at Roy. "I was a better officer before I opened my mouth that morning than I was while my mouth was open. I'm trying to be better than both of those." Roy looked at him for a moment. The gray eyes. Then something moved in them that was not warmth exactly, but was the predecessor of warmth. The shift in a man who has assessed something and found it adequate. He pushed open the diner door and held it. "Sunday breakfast," he said. "Come on." They sat for 2 hours. Lassiter asked nothing about Chosin. He asked about the mop. Why, after everything, the mop? Roy was quiet for a moment, and then said that the floor needed cleaning, and he'd cleaned floors before, and the floor didn't care who you were. Which was one of the things that made it honest work, and Lassiter wrote none of it down, but carried all of it. When the check came, Roy had it before Lassiter's hand reached the table. Outside, in the January cold, Lassiter watched Roy Callahan walk toward the parking lot in the gray work shirt and the rubber-soled shoes. He watched until Roy got into a plain sedan, and the car moved and was gone. And then he stood in the cold for a moment and looked at the portraits in his memory, the ones on the walls at Quantico. 60 years of faces, and understood something about who puts them there. The men and women who built this institution walk its corridors every day. They carry their history quietly, in the work they still do, in the patch on the shirt pocket, in the steadiness of hands that have held everything they were given and set none of it down. They are mopping floors and drinking Sunday coffee, and they do not announce themselves, and they do not require you to understand what you are standing next to. But if you are paying the right kind of attention, you will. If you were moved by Roy's story of quiet courage and timeless wisdom, hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to see it, and be sure to subscribe to Veterans Valor for more stories of America's unassuming heroes. And click that notification bell so you never miss a story of the quiet warriors who walk among us.